Vivid verses.
There is a particular quality to silence that only reveals itself in hindsight. A texture you don't notice while you're living inside it, like the specific weight of an autumn that felt mild until the cold arrived, and you realize you've been barely warm the whole time. I understand that now. I understood it the night Camille called me for the last time, her voice carrying that specific pitch of someone who has rehearsed the opening line so many times it no longer sounds like her. I listened to her say she was ready. I listened to the pause that followed, full and expectant, the pause of someone who believed they were handing me something I'd spent years waiting to receive. I told her I'd become certain too, just not in the direction she meant. She went quiet, not the quiet of processing, not the quiet of absorbing a blow, the quiet of someone recalibrating an entire narrative in real time, discovering that the story she'd been telling herself had a different protagonist. I heard her breathing. I didn't fill the silence. I've learned that when people go quiet that way, filling the silence is almost always a mistake. What it does is give them a new thing to respond to, which lets them off the hook of sitting with what you've actually said. So I waited. That's where this ends. But it began as most things that last long enough to matter do, somewhere much quieter and more ordinary. I met Camille at a mutual friend's dinner. 8 people around a table that comfortably seated 6, mismatched chairs pulled in from other rooms, a candle that had burned too far down and kept threatening the tablecloth. She was 2 seats away, and she had an opinion about everything. The wine, the city council's road repaving schedule, whether a film everyone had seen 6 months ago had earned its ending. She wasn't loud about any of it. She was precise. The kind of person who waits for the right gap in a conversation and then fills it with something exact, something that slightly advances the frame of what's being discussed rather than just adding volume to it. I noticed that before I noticed anything else about her. It was the first thing I registered. Not her face, which I cataloged later, once I was paying closer attention, but that particular quality of precision. The way she chose her words, the way you'd choose something you were going to carry a long way, looking for what was worth the wait. I introduced myself during the dessert slowdown, when the group had fractured into smaller conversations and the candle had finally given up. She looked at me the way perceptive people look at strangers, not appraisingly, not dismissively, but with a kind of suspended curiosity, like she was waiting to see what additional data the conversation would produce before filing any initial impression. We talked for somewhere between 40 minutes and an hour. I genuinely didn't track the time. I don't often lose track of time in social situations. I tend to stay oriented, maintain some background awareness of the room, the clock, the shape of the evening. Whether I didn't, I was just there in the conversation, not monitoring anything. I remember walking to my car afterward and thinking, that was interesting, not as an assessment of her specifically, but as an observation about what had just happened to me. I'd been genuinely engaged, not politely engaged. Those two things feel different from the inside, and I've learned to pay attention to the difference. I know, looking back now, that what I was drawn to was exactly what would eventually become the problem. That precision, that measured quality, the sense that Camille never said or did anything without having turned it over first. It's an attractive trait in a person until you realize it means she applies the same deliberation to everything, including you, including the question of whether you are what she wants, and that the deliberation doesn't necessarily resolve. That it can run indefinitely. That for some people, the thinking and the deciding are 2 different processes that don't automatically connect. But that's hindsight again. That evening, I just thought she was interesting. We were together for several years before I proposed the first time. Not a short relationship. Not something built on impulse or insufficient information. There was a lot of time and a lot of ordinary life between that dinner and the question I eventually asked her on her back patio. By the time I asked, I knew how she took her coffee, black with 1 sugar, stir more times than necessary, the stirring a kind of thinking. I knew the particular way her mood shifted in the 2 days before a difficult conversation she'd been avoiding. She'd become slightly more efficient, slightly more organized, as if preparing herself logistically for something emotional. I knew which of her friends she genuinely trusted and which one she maintained out of a long history that felt too complicated to revise. I knew what she looked like at the end of a genuinely bad week. Quieter than usual, but the quietness of a person who was still processing, not the quietness of a person who had given up. I knew what she needed in those moments. Not encouragement, not analysis, just company that asked nothing of her for a few hours. I knew her. I was certain of that. The proposal itself was not elaborate because I'd thought about what elaborate would communicate and decided it communicated the wrong things. Elaborate proposals have a logic built into them. The cost of having orchestrated it, the cost of saying no in front of whatever audience has been assembled. I didn't want her decision made inside that kind of architecture. I wanted it made cleanly, with a clear view of the question, without any social pressure that would cloud what she actually thought. We were on her back patio. One of those warm evenings that turns up occasionally in the late part of the year and seems almost apologetic about it, like the weather has noticed it owes you something. I made dinner. Nothing complicated, just the pasta she liked, the one she'd walked me through making properly 3 years earlier and then never let me forget I'd initially gotten wrong. We'd been sitting outside with the wine going warm in the glasses because neither of us had thought to move, and the conversation had drifted into the comfortable non-conversation of people who have been together long enough that silence doesn't require filling. I asked her. The pause before she responded lasted long enough that I clocked it. Not long in terms of seconds, 4, 5, something in that range, but long in terms of what it communicated. Long in the specific way of a pause that precedes something you didn't expect to have to navigate. In those 4 or 5 seconds, sitting across from her in the cooling evening, I watched something move across her face. A microsecond of what I can only describe as recalibration, as if the question had arrived ahead of where she'd imagined it would arrive. I cataloged that. I didn't react to it, didn't let my expression change, but I put it somewhere precise. She said she loved me. She said it the way she said things she meant, directly and without ornamentation. She said she was sure of that. She said she just wanted to be completely certain before making a commitment of that magnitude, that she thought certainty deserved more time to arrive fully, to settle in properly, and that she didn't want to say yes before she was really sure, because yes deserved to be said from a place of genuine certainty and not from a place of thinking she was probably mostly certain and that would probably be enough. She was calm. She was kind. She was apologetic in the particular way. She was apologetic about everything. Full eye contact, no performative distress, no crying, no elaborate justification. Just an honest account of where she was, delivered with the same care she applied to everything. I told her I understood. I meant it. Here is what I did not tell her. In the space of her response, something had quietly started in the back of my mind. Not anger, not hurt in the way that goes looking for sympathy, something more like attention. A small, careful quality of attention I hadn't been paying before. The kind of attention you pay when you've been handed something that you're not sure yet whether it's data or noise, and you decided to hold it until you know. I noted the pause. I filed it. I waited. The year that followed was, by every external measure, ordinary and largely good. We didn't become tense. The subject of marriage didn't settle over us like an unresolved argument. Camille didn't treat it as a wound she was protecting, and I didn't treat it as a wound I'd received. We were both people who processed things and moved forward, who didn't allow unresolved matters to leak into unrelated ones. It was one of the things I'd always valued about how we worked together, the cleanliness of our conflict, such as it was. But the background process was running. Not consciously, I wasn't sitting with a notepad, cataloging evidence against her. It was more like a perceptual shift, the way once you hear a sound you'd been filtering out, you can't filter it out again. I began to notice, across many ordinary days, how Camille handled certainty in the rest of her life. She was decisive in general, remarkably so, for someone who'd asked for more time to be certain about us. She could walk into a situation with 50 competing variables and extract a course of action before most people had finished defining the problem. She'd made significant changes in her life, left a job she'd held for years, stopped speaking to a family member whose behavior she'd been tolerating for longer, moved apartments when the previous one stopped making sense. All of these things done with what looked from the outside like composure, but was actually confidence. When she was sure about something, she was sure. She didn't need time to arrive at it. Time was just how long it took her to execute the decision, not how long it took her to reach it. I thought about a conversation we'd had early in the relationship when she'd been deciding whether to leave that job. She described the process. She'd known within a week of taking the new role that it wasn't right for her, had spent another 2 weeks confirming the feeling rather than overriding it, and then acted. 2.5 weeks from the first signal to a clear conclusion. I'd admired the decisiveness at the time. I was still admiring it now, just from a slightly different angle. I held that observation carefully. I didn't press it into the shape of an argument I was planning to make. I didn't confront her with it or bring it up strategically during some unrelated moment. I just held it and let it mean what it meant, which was her uncertainty about me was not a feature of her temperament broadly. It was specific. It was located. It was us she was uncertain about, not commitment as an abstract, not permanence as an idea. She was uncertain about the specific fact of me. I let that sit for a while. It was worth sitting with. 14 months after the first proposal, on an ordinary Sunday evening, the aimless, low-key Sunday that the week produces when it's had a long week and just wants to be done, I asked her again. The Sunday itself was not planned as the occasion. The occasion was planned, and the Sunday was just what offered itself. I decided somewhere in the months of sitting with things that I was going to ask again at some point during that year. I'd also decided, without drama, without grief, without announcing it to myself too loudly, that if the answer was the same, I would have all the information I needed. She looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. In that moment, the background process produced an output with something close to certainty. The answer is the same. Not as a judgment, not as a wound, just as a read. I was good at reading her by then, after all the years, and what I saw in her face was not a woman finding her way to yes. It was a woman who had been hoping, on some level, that this conversation would wait a little longer. She said she loved me. She said she was sure she wanted to be with me. That wasn't the question. She wanted me to know that. She said she still needed more time to arrive at genuine certainty, that she knew how that sounded, that she was sorry. And then the detail I stored precisely, the detail that completed the picture. She said she was getting closer. Getting closer. There was a specific thing that phrase did to the calculation I'd been running. It didn't change the output. It confirmed it. Getting closer is the language of someone who hasn't decided. It's progress language, process language. It's the language of someone for whom the answer is still approaching from a distance. After the years we'd had, after the length of time she'd had to observe me and consider me and know me, after all of that, she was getting closer. I thanked her for being honest with me. I always thanked her for that, because she always was, and because it mattered, and because whatever I was feeling, that part was still true. That night, alone in the kitchen while she was reading in the other room, I stood with my hands on the counter for several minutes. Not dramatic, not grief, not the kind of feeling that requires an audience. Just a quiet finalization of a calculation I'd mostly already completed. Examining the output, deciding that the output was reliable. She wasn't uncertain because she was cautious. Camille was not, as a rule, cautious. She was uncertain about me specifically. She had all the information. She'd had it for years, and she still couldn't say yes. And the honest thing, the thing I kept turning over in the kitchen in the quiet, was that no amount of additional time was going to resolve that. If time were the cure for her uncertainty about me, it had already had an extensive opportunity to work. The fact that she was still getting closer, still not arrived, after all this time, was not a function of insufficient data. It was a function of the answer. She was kind enough not to see it that way, or careful enough, or perhaps not fully honest enough with herself about what her own uncertainty was telling her. I didn't know which of those was true, and I wasn't angry about any of them. They were all just things that could be true about a person you knew well and cared about, and had been with long enough that you could map the edges of their blind spots. I went back into the other room. We watched something on television. She fell asleep against my shoulder, and I stayed awake for a while, not agonizing, just thinking. The quiet, methodical thinking of someone who has made a decision and is now working out its implications. The leaving took months and looked from the outside like almost nothing. This is the part people get wrong when they hear a story like this. They imagine some turn, some visible fracture, some conversation where everything comes apart. There wasn't one. There didn't need to be. I wasn't angry. I wasn't performing a cold exit that I hoped would make her ask questions. I was just doing, incrementally and without announcement, what I decided to do. I rebuilt the architecture of my life so that it didn't depend on her. Gradually, I called friends I'd let go quiet. Not a crisis of sociality, just an easy drift that years in a relationship will produce, and which now needed reversing. I accepted invitations I'd been declining, dinners, a weekend trip, an evening with a colleague I'd been meaning to make time for. I started spending evenings in a different rhythm. I was not engineering distance as a signal, not manufacturing absence to make her notice and ask. That would have been a kind of plea, a way of saying, look what you're pushing me toward. And I'd made a decision. I wasn't interested in being talked out of it. I was interested in executing it cleanly. I also found in the quiet spaces of that time something unexpected. I could see for the first time in years what I wanted on the other side. Not a replacement for Camille. That's not how I think about people, as interchangeable occupants of a designated slot in a structure. I mean something more specific, a clearer sense of what a future I was actually choosing freely, without question, would feel like. I wanted someone who wanted me the way I wanted her. Not more. Not with more pressure or more need or more performance. Just pointed the same direction. Certain in the same way. I've been missing that. I understood it only now, with the distance of a decision already made. Not affection. Camille had that. Not loyalty. Not shared history. Not the particular warmth of years with a person you know to the bone. All of that had been real. What had been missing was simpler than any of that. The sense that she was in it the way I was in it. That when she imagined her future, I was in it not as a possibility she was weighing, but as a settled fact. She hadn't settled it. That was her right. But I had finally settled mine. I signed a lease before I told her I was leaving. I want to be precise about that because it sounds harsh, and it wasn't. Or rather, the reason for the sequence wasn't harsh, even if the sequence itself might look that way. If I had come to her with the idea of leaving still open, with the place still hypothetical, the conversation would have become about whether I should leave. She would have said the things you say in that conversation. I would have heard them. They would have created a gravitational pull back toward the old position. And I wasn't trying to have a conversation about whether I should leave. I'd already had that conversation with myself and reached a conclusion. What I was trying to do was tell her something, not negotiate something. I had a place. It was clean, smaller than what we'd shared, with a kitchen that got good light in the mornings. I'd been in it twice before I told her, once to sign, once to measure for furniture, and both times I'd stood in it and felt, with a clarity that surprised me, that it was correct, that this was the right scale for where I was. When I told her, she went very still. I thought about how to have the conversation. I'd run it in my head a number of times, not scripting it exactly, more like stress testing it, looking for the places where it could become something other than what I intended. I decided, be clear, be kind, don't negotiate, don't justify in a way that invites counterargument. She hadn't done anything wrong. I wasn't leaving because of a wrong she'd done. I was leaving because I'd been asking her a question for years, in one form or another, and she'd been answering it, and the answer she kept giving me wasn't the one I needed. She asked if there was something she could do. I told her no. I told her she hadn't done anything wrong, that I meant that I wasn't saying it as a courtesy. I told her what I actually believed, that she was someone who hadn't been certain, and I was someone who had decided that uncertainty at this stage, after all the time we'd had, wasn't something I was willing to keep waiting on, and that both of those facts were just true, and neither of them made either of us the villain in anything. She asked me if I was sure. I told her I was. She looked at me for a long moment. I've been looked at that way before, usually by people who are waiting to see if a firmly stated position will crack under examination. I held her look steadily, without aggression, without apology. I was just sure. She could see it. She didn't push. We hugged when I left. A long one, the kind that doesn't perform anything. Not a movie goodbye, not a heightened ending. Just two people standing in the factual presence of something that had finished. I drove to my new place with my first carload of things, and I didn't sit in any parking lot reconsidering anything. I unloaded what I brought. I ordered food. I sat on the floor of my new kitchen, surrounded by my own things in the good morning light space, and I felt, with genuine and somewhat unexpected clarity, not devastated, settled, as if a question I'd been carrying for too long had finally been put down. Her name was Ingrid. I'd known her peripherally for 2 years before I actually knew her. She worked in an adjacent part of the same building, and we'd exchanged maybe half a dozen words across those 2 years, the kind of words that pass between people who pass each other in corridors and occupy the same professional world without actually occupying the same space. I actually spoke to her at a retirement gathering for someone we'd both worked with in the distant past and barely knew. Small conference room, too bright overhead lighting, weak coffee. That particular atmosphere of people being warmly present for someone they don't know well enough to be genuinely sad about losing. I ended up at the edge of the room next to her, and we found ourselves in the same situation. Happy for the person, glad they'd had what seemed like a decent run of it, without much to actually say. She observed, without preamble or particular emphasis, that events like this always made her want to evaluate every professional relationship she'd ever had and ask herself whether it would produce genuine goodwill or just polite attendance. I told her that was a dark thing to think at someone's retirement party. She said she meant it as a motivator, not a verdict. I thought about that on the drive home. I thought about the precision of the distinction, motivator, not verdict, and about how quickly she'd reach for it, and about the quality of attention it suggested. That kind of clarification is not a defensive move. It's the move of someone who knows exactly what they mean and wants to be understood accurately, not managed. I filed it. I asked, a few days later, if she wanted to have coffee. She said yes without a beat and named a day. I noted that. I noted it in a different internal folder than the one I'd been keeping for years. We had coffee. We had coffee again the following week. I was not in any rush. I was the furthest thing from a rush. I had just spent the better part of a year quietly dismantling a long relationship, and I was not in any state to rush anything. And she didn't seem to need a rush. We were both people who thought carefully, who paid attention to what was in front of them, who didn't move faster than the actual information warranted. None of that was different from what I'd known before. What was different was something I didn't have immediate language for. Ingrid moved through those early conversations with a quality that I kept trying to name and kept almost getting right. She was not performing interest. She was not managing her openness the way you manage a resource. When she was engaged, not demonstrably, not as a signal she was sending me, but just as the factual condition of being there. When something struck her as good, she said so. When something I said landed interestingly, her expression showed it without delay. She wasn't holding any of it at arm's length and assessing it while it waited for a verdict. I noticed across those early weeks that I kept expecting some version of the hedge I'd been used to. Some hint of managed distance, some evidence of deliberation held visibly in reserve. It didn't come. She wasn't reckless. That's not what I mean. She wasn't performing enthusiasm she didn't feel or rushing towards something she wasn't ready for. She was just there, present, already knowing, apparently, what she wanted. And when she wanted something from the conversation, a different angle on a topic, more of a line of thinking I'd started, she asked for it directly. No circling, no hinting. She just asked. I caught myself, during one of those early coffees, waiting for the qualification. The "but I should say," or the "I don't want to get ahead of things." It didn't come then either. I sat with that for a moment, there in the corner of the cafe, and had the quiet experience of recognizing that I had been prepared for a particular kind of relationship and was now sitting inside a different kind entirely. I learned something sitting across from her that I hadn't known to look for before. There's a version of caution that isn't actually caution. It's protection. It's a kind of armor worn by someone who hasn't finished deciding whether the situation warrants risk. And there is a version of openness that isn't recklessness either. It's just a person who has already done the internal work, who knows what they're about, and who doesn't require the performance of uncertainty to feel like they've been sufficiently careful. Camille had applied her precision to me the way she applied it to decisions she genuinely hadn't made yet. The precision was real. The uncertainty was real. What I'd missed for years was that her not knowing was not a temporary condition on its way to resolution. It was just what she felt. Ingrid's openness had no architecture of deliberation underneath it. It wasn't a position she'd arrived at after extensive consideration. It was just where she was. I think it took me a long time to be able to articulate that distinction. I could feel it before I could say it. The feeling was specific. This is a different weight entirely. Months passed. Good months. The kind where you don't find yourself taking stock because everything is moving in a direction that doesn't require constant monitoring. The kind where you make plans that assume the future is going to cooperate with you. I wasn't in a hurry toward anything because I was already somewhere good. Ingrid and I build a life the way lives get built. Not through ceremony, but through accumulation, through 1,000 small decisions that keep pointing the same direction without being asked to. I thought about Camille sometimes. Not often, and not with any particular weight. There was nothing unresolved in it. No resentment, no second-guessing, none of the revisionary regret that arrives when you've ended something badly or for bad reasons. I'd ended it for the clearest possible reason. She'd told me, in the only language available to her for it, what she actually felt, and I'd listened and acted accordingly. That was the whole of it. I'd heard through mutual orbit, the small world phenomenon of shared social networks slowly reconfiguring after the end of a long relationship, that she was seeing someone. I was glad. Not with any complicated gladness. Not with the gladness that has something to prove. Just straightforwardly glad, the way you're glad when someone you cared about seems to be okay. I thought she'd figured out whatever it was that had made certainty difficult, whether it was the particular of me or something in herself she needed to work through, or some combination of both. It wasn't my question anymore. I had different questions. better ones for where I was.
Thanks for listening.